Remember field trips and first dates? Generations have come to the Exploratorium to learn and play. Now we need your help, and every dollar you donate will be doubled. Sustain the wonder.
Thank you for joining us tonight for After Dark Online, 500 Queer Scientists. My name is Koso Polacco. I am part of the STARS program at the Exploratorium. STARS stands for Striving Toward Inclusion and Anti-Racism Within STEM. We are a group of diverse interns that provide lots of insight into the Exploratorium's programming and museum experience. While tonight's program was recorded remotely, I want to acknowledge that the home of After Dark, the Exploratorium, is located at Pier 15 in San Francisco on unceded territory, traditionally belonging to the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and pay respect to elders past, present, and future for the stewardship of this land. Tonight's After Dark kicks off a month of programs celebrating Pride. Representation matters in science and everywhere. In this program, we'll be sharing with you more about the visibility campaigns, 500 Queer Scientists, and AAAS If Then. Later in the program, we will hear from two If Then ambassadors, Dana Bowles and Dr. Jessica Esquivel, about their work in STEM, as well as their advocating for equity and diversity within the sciences. To get started, we will learn more about 500 Queer Scientists and If Then from Dr. Lauren Esposito. Dr. Lauren Esposito is a curator of Schlinger Chair of Arachnology at the California Academy of Sciences. Lauren's current research investigates the patterns and processes of evolution in spiders, scorpions, with a focus on tropical islands. Originally from the US-Mexico borderlands, she completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Texas, El Paso, and went on to obtain an MS and PhD from the American Museum of Natural History, in collaboration with the City University of New York. Lauren is a co-founder director of a science, education, and conservation nonprofit called Islands and Seas, and the co-creator of 500 Queer Scientists, a visibility campaign for LGBTQ+ people working in STEM careers. Lauren is joined in conversation by my colleague, Sal Alper, who is the manager of explainers at the Exploratorium, who is also a great leader and collaborator that provides STARS with lots of guidance.
So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Happy Pride.
Yay, happy Pride.
It's great to have you here. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of your different programs, but I wanted to start us out by having you share a little bit about how you became interested in science as a young person and your path to pursuing your career.
I feel like that's like a loaded question, because I didn't, as a young person, really know that I liked science. I mean, I knew I liked science class, but I wasn't like, I want to be a scientist when I grew up. Like, there was really no point at which I made that self-declaration. Like, I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be, like, I feel like a lot of kids are like, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And I think like what sort of best exemplifies that is that when I was in the 6th grade, my homeroom class, which, like, to be honest, homeroom classes are not supposed to assign you things. I feel like that's just wrong. But this homeroom teacher gave us an assignment, and the assignment was that we had to write like an essay about what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I like was very upset about the assignment because I didn't feel like I shouldn't have to know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I feel like that's, like, for everyone out there, that's a reasonable expectation to have of children, is that they not know what they want to be. And so I like remember I cried about the assignment. It was like one of those assignments where you go home and you're just like, oh, I can't do this. And in the end, I like kind of wrote a cheeky essay that was sort of based in truth, which was that I wasn't decided, but I either wanted to be like a rocket scientist or a hobo. And I mean like the ride the rails kind of hobo, not like a derogatory term hobo. I mean it like in the positive sense of like seeing the world on a shoestring, living the life of traveling. And my teacher gave me a 0, which I was kind of like devastated about, because I feel like that was a very reasonable response to a question for a 10-year-old, or I don't remember. How old are you in 6th grade? I don't know.
Yeah, 11.
10, 11, 12. Okay, somewhere between 10 and 12-year-old child. And like, but in hindsight, I actually feel like I sort of nailed that. Like my job today is travel the world, do cutting edge science, and most of the time I'm on a shoestring budget. So I nailed it. Take that. I don't remember what her name is. Mrs.
Yeah.
something.
I think the rocket science hobo has a lot of connections there too. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about your career and how it connects to being a rocket science hobo.
Yeah, so nowadays I'm the curator of arachnology at the California Academy of Sciences, and I am responsible for doing research. I run a lab at the Cal Academy. A lot of people don't know that the Cal Academy is an active research institution, and so we have labs and we have graduate students who come to study at the Cal Academy with us, and we do projects that are based on things like genetics, but all really centered around understanding life on Earth and the history of life on Earth through evolution, and predicting the future of life on Earth in the face of things like continued global change and increasing human disturbance in natural environments. And so my main gig really is studying arachnids. That's things like spiders and scorpions and other small, hard-bodied, eight-legged such creatures that live on land, mostly. And I specialize on tropical islands. So really what that comes down to is I study scorpions and spiders on tropical islands all over the world, which is like where the traveling comes in and the rocket science comes in, that I use genetics to understand how they're related to one another. It's like 23andMe for scorpions.
Awesome. And so you're an active scientist, right? You're doing your own research. So what brought you into trying to do more advocacy visibility work?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I never considered myself an advocate of anything. Like I never was like, oh, I'm an activist. And I've always been like, the queer community has always been a really big part of my life, but I don't know that I was ever like advocating for the queer community in any way. And well, that's kind of a tragedy in many respects, but I think what ultimately led me to advocacy work is that I had this moment of self-reflection where I had like gotten my dream job. It's at the Cal Academy of Sciences. I did my PhD. I did a postdoc at UC Berkeley, and finally I landed this job that like I'd wanted for a decade. And then I found myself feeling in some way that I couldn't quite put my finger on, like different from a lot of my colleagues. And it took me a while to figure out what that difference was, and eventually I realized that it was because I was queer, and so my life experiences in so many ways did not match the life experiences of most of my colleagues who are straight, heterosexual, cisgender, heteronormative. And I in a professional space, I couldn't really talk to them about my life experiences because it felt awkward. And the only reason for that is that like at work, I was being made unintentionally. I mean, I have very supportive colleagues, but just because of the culture of working in science, I was being made to feel othered. And so I kind of had this realization that I was actually the first openly queer curator in the history of the Cal Academy, which at that point in time, the Cal Academy, as like one of the earliest institutions in San Francisco, had been around for like 165 years. At the time that I was having this epiphany. I think it's 168 years old now. And I thought that like, if I feel so alone and isolated in my job, I had never shared a lab space with another queer person. I had never studied with another queer person in one of my research labs. And now I was the first curator in the history of this old institution to be openly queer, and probably the first not to be openly queer as well, although it's hard to find that kind of information for people that are like back deeper in history where it was much more obscured. But like, if I feel that way, then other people must feel that way too. Like, it's not just me. I live in probably the gay friendliest city in America, San Francisco. So people that live in, I don't know, North Dakota probably feel the same way that I do, but perhaps even more isolated and less accepted. So I think that's sort of what brought me down the eventual avenue of advocacy.
Lovely. Yeah, and so yeah, tell us a little bit about the 500 Queer Scientists and If Then project.
Yeah, sure. So 500 Queer Scientists is a visibility campaign that I launched 3 years ago in June of 2018. I had to like do math for a second there. It's like, how many years ago is? And also we had like a gap year because of COVID. So but June of 2018. And I launched it with 50 stories of people that identify as LGBTQ plus in STEM that I had been able to collect from like friends and colleagues and friends of friends, just like kind of sending feelers out there and seeing if I could find other queer scientists out there in the world. Because I really didn't know any. I mean, I sort of knew of some and thought that maybe some other people could be queer, but I didn't, it was not something I ever talked to people about. And so we launched this visibility campaign with those 50 stories. And we have a website, 500queerscientists.com, and we also have social media on Twitter and Instagram where we post profiles, and we opened it up to the community to contribute their own stories. And each of these stories is like 250 words and a photo, just people celebrating their journey in STEM and what it means for them to be queer in STEM. And now we've grown to like 1,500 contributors, and we get like 10,000 website visits a month. And so clearly, like, there was a need out there beyond just my selfish reasons for creating this visibility campaign to meet other queer scientists, that there's just, it's like one of those hidden attributes in STEM that's not allowed to be talked about in the workplace because of the norms put in place by the people that were the forefathers, the founding fathers of STEM, which were like cisgender, heterosexual, like European white men who felt like anybody who didn't fit that like very narrow box of who should be participating in STEM should be made to feel isolated or intentionally isolated and excluded. And so that's been really great. And it's been amazing to see the community grow and evolve, and also really just to hear everyone celebrate themselves in a way that is exciting. And you know, in the spirit of pride really is about showing their pride for not only how they identify under the umbrella of queerness, but also their pride for their work and how that unique identity has contributed to their pathway in that work. And that's actually what brought me to like this next evolution of the concept of 500 Queer Scientists, which is an exhibit that's being funded by a grant, and the work of the exhibits being funded by a grant from the American Society. Geez, I always get this wrong. The Association for Science and Technology Centers, and ASTEC is the acronym, and it's funded by ASTEC and the Lyda Hill Philanthropies Foundation, and they provide money for institutions like museums to use assets in this collection that they've gathered of women in STEM. It's called the If Then collection, and it features like the most amazing women scientists from all over the country. And they offer these grants to feature those women on the public floor of science museums because they want to increase the gender inequity of the kinds of people that are displayed on the public floor to like the general population as what a scientist looks like. Overwhelmingly, when you walk into a science museum, what a scientist looks like is exactly what you already have as a stereotype in your mind. And so that this grant opportunity is really intended to change that. But what I noticed in their call for submissions to apply for this opportunity was that they also included gender minorities in addition to women. And so I got this idea that, well, maybe we could create an exhibit that focuses on telling the stories of LGBTQ identifying women and non-binary people, trans people, gender non-conforming people, two-spirit people, all the diversity of gender representation that we see in and outside of STEM, and really celebrate those people and their stories. But I think more importantly, celebrate how their intersectionality and the intersectionality of their identities as people of color, as women, as gender non-conforming people, alongside their identity in STEM is not a barrier to inclusion, but rather a doorway to science. We know that science is better when the people participating in it are more diverse. It's like, this is actually a scientific fact. People have studied when major like steps forward in our understanding of science occur, and who makes up the group of people that are working together at that time when that step forward is made. And the greater diversity that you have represented in that body of scientists or STEM professionals working together, the higher the probability that you're going to make huge advances. And that's because everybody brings this diverse perspective. And so in that sense, your unique intersectional identity is not a barrier, although there may have been many obstacles placed in your path along the way. But ultimately, your success in overcoming those obstacles is a unique asset that allows you to look at questions differently, but also interpret the answers differently. And so that identity is really all about being a doorway and really a new kind of science, which is the title of the exhibit, by the way, New Science.
Oh, nice. I didn't know that. Great. Do you have any examples of times that you've seen queerness as an asset in a scientist's work or in your work?
I mean, I think like at the most basic level, and it's hard for me to be reflective about my own work because I don't know that like I ever think about how my identity affects my work, but it's easier to see in other people's work, which, you know, I think in the most fundamental, it's a question of like when we're studying differences in differences within, like, say, a species, is there has to be like an understanding of what is the difference between biological sex and gender, but also that like biological sex as we attribute it in humans, which is most people consider male and female, although there's like a huge body of evidence to suggest that it's not that simple. But for the scientists that are practicing that work, to make that binary distinction in nature that everything's either male or female and there's nothing in between and there's no other options is like a very unfortunate way of approaching that kind of research. So including groups of people that come from this diverse perspective and diverse background, like at its most basic, including women in studies about like gender and nature and sex and nature, is already like an entryway. Because like if you think about how most male scientists almost universally recognized the male sex in biological species as being the more dominant or the more aggressive. But when women researchers entered the scene, they were like, no, actually, these are matriarchal. Some of these animals or whatever have matriarchal societies, and it's not like a male dominated system. But of course, like the old fashioned men who were interpreting that data in the first place, like wanted to interpret it within their own worldview. And their worldview was that like women stayed at home and watched kids, and men like were smart and went to work and made discoveries. So when they interpret the animal world, they're going to interpret it under the restrictions of that worldview. And even as simple as including women in the science itself enables a diverse framing for like understanding the observations that you're making.
For sure. Can you tell us a little bit more about one of the scientists you're featuring in your work and like why you feel like that person's visibility matters?
Well, I think the person I want to talk about is like basically my science hero, and like I'm very lucky to also consider her a close friend and colleague. And her name is Dr. Jessica Ware. She's actually also a curator. She's a curator of insects at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And she studies dragonflies, damselflies, termites, and roaches. So like some things that people think are very beautiful, but also some things that people really hate. But, you know, for me, like she really embodies like the diverse perspective brought by intersectional identities. She's mixed race Canadian, now American. She was born in Canada, grew up in Canada, and immigrated to the US. And like brings that geographic background of growing up to the way that she interprets and interacts with the world, but also brings the background of growing up in a mixed race family and having a twin who is transgender and grew up as an identical twin. So she grew up having an identical twin sister who later in life realized that they identified as a man and transitioned. And like that experience of like coming to terms with her own identity as like through the shift of being an identical twin and suddenly is no longer an identical twin, like suddenly is in like a two gendered twin sibling relationship. Also like coming to terms with her identity as a bisexual woman, and now raising children who identify under the LGBTQ umbrella. And on top of all of that, she's like an incredible scientist, like absolutely incredible. She is a recipient of a PCASE, the Presidential Early Career, I don't remember the whole acronym, but it's like an award given by the President of the United States to recognize like really exceptional early career researchers. So she's received that award. It's not just me that's recognizing her as being amazing. And I'm like so excited that she agreed to be in this exhibit, because I think stories like hers of success in the face of like a lot of obstacles, but like ultimately coming out to be a person that's strong and visible. She's currently the like rising president of the Entomological Society of America. So she has a position where she can really celebrate her identity and do so in a way that elevates other people alongside her, and brings a lot of those intersections of her identity like up with her. And she's very intentional about that. So I love that about her. Can you hear this dog barking in the background?
Yeah.
Got a
What's
lot
your
to
dog?
say. Chicha.
Awesome. Well, we talked a little bit about how the sciences benefit from having more queer diversity and just more diversity in general of thought. What do you, on the other side of it, why do you think the LGBTQ plus communities should care about the field of science or be putting any effort in that direction around STEM?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's such a good question. I mean, the reality is about why you should care is that like science has been used to exclude LGBTQ people from mainstream society for a long time. Like people have justified the exclusion of queer people based on like science, and that's because the people that participating in science were all non-queer, and so they got to make up the rules about like using the science for bad rather than for good. And so when our perspectives are represented, first it helps to ensure that things like that don't ever happen again. And it may not be that it's happening to queer people, it could be that it's happening to some other similarly marginalized or disenfranchised groups, but because of the past history of queer identities, we're able to recognize that and intervene. Everybody's always in some relative position of power to some other marginalized group. And so I think that like in that there's also a responsibility for allyship in marginalized people themselves, like to help folks that need help when they need help. And I think that we're seeing that right now, for example, a lot in the trans community, among trans people within our own community. And so like the more LGBT representation there is in science, the more we can strengthen the argument for greater protection of trans rights, and use a scientific basis for strengthening that argument. I think also it just really helps us have a better understanding of the world around us. Like we need those diverse backgrounds and experiences and lenses through which people view and interpret the world if we're ever going to have a chance of understanding this like crazy world that we live in. And I mean that like both in the biological sense, but also in like physics and like computational engineering. And another person that we're featuring in the exhibit is an AI researcher, and is like trying to ensure that when machines recognize people's genders, that information is not being used for bad, in particular in the case of like LGBTQ identifying people. Like the last thing we want is the people that are like behind the computer software, like recognizing people in cameras all over the world, to start using that information to target LGBTQ communities in a negative way. So we need those people that are there to ensure that we're being not only seen, like actually seen, but that the information that comes from this is not being used for negative outcomes.
For sure. Thank you. Okay, to round us out, how do you think your personal path into science might be a little bit different if things like the 500 Queer Science and If Then projects existed when you were younger?
I I never felt like there was a place for my queer identity in like during school or in my professional life. I like actually in high school kind of like faced this point in time where I either was going to drop out of high school or I needed to graduate early because of my queer identity, because I just felt very excluded. And I ended up graduating early, like good news for my mom, I guess. Rather than getting a GED, which I feel like would have been fine, but anyways. Um, and but I think if I had seen like that people like me were accepted in places that I thought was cool, like if I'd seen a queer scientist at NASA as a young person, like that would have had a really substantial impact on me. And similarly, like once I started down the pathway of studying and working professionally as a scientist, like if I'd known that other queer scientists were out there and it was something that we could just talk about instead of something I felt like I had to keep hidden all the time, I would have felt much more accepted and stopped questioning me to some extent. I think I always question I have like the worst imposter syndrome. I would have stopped questioning to some extent whether or not I belonged in science. I mean, I can remember I have this like vivid experience of this one thing that happened in my first year of my PhD. I was raising a son in graduate school, and I just like didn't, like to talk about how I was raising a 10-year-old child. I guess he was like 12 at that time, as a like 23-year-old, was like just opening this can of worms into my personal identity and my personal life and my queerness that like I didn't want to open with people because I didn't feel comfortable exposing that aspect of my identity in what I thought was professional settings. And I can remember this person saying, "I didn't know you had a son," and me being like, son, I don't have a son." But like, of course I have a son. Like I had a child living with me that like I care about more than anything else in the world. And like I had this moment of panic where I was like, no, I don't. You must be mistaken. But if, like, absolutely, I had a son. I just didn't want to talk to the person that was asking me about him because I didn't want like the origin story of my relationship with my son to come up because I knew it would introduce like my queer identity. And so I think if there was greater visibility for queer people at that point in my life, I would have understood that it was okay. And now I think definitely like I hope that we're forging a path forward for people to be able to talk about their identity and actually just celebrate their identity, not only talk about it within the context of professional spaces for people working in science, tech, engineering, and math and beyond.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lauren, so much for your work as a scientist, an advocate, and as a museum educator. Thank you for all that you do, and hope you have a great Pride.
Woohoo!
Yeah, take care.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
The exhibit Lauren mentioned, New Science, launches on June 24th. Up next, we will hear from If Then Ambassador Dana Bowles, who was part of the exhibition that Lauren spoke about. Dana Bowles has been working in engineering for over 20 years. Having been born with no legs, Dana rides an electric wheelchair to be independent. During her education, Dana focused on studying engineering. She thought, if I can't find useful equipment to help me with activities, I can design it as an engineer. Dana went on to get a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering. Dana will be joined in conversation by Lavender DeJulia, who is part of the STARS cohort at the Exploratorium.
Dana, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. My name is Lavender. I work here at the Exploratorium as a STARS intern. STARS stands for, thank you. STARS stands for, see if I get this, Striving for Trans Inclusion and Anti-Racism Work in. That's a little bit of what I do. And I found that a lot of what you do actually resonates with that message. So I'd love to kind of dive in and talk about that. I'd love to start with your engineering journey and your journey as a self-proclaimed disabled engineer. I would love your thoughts on maybe, or just perspective on what it means to have accessible design, and maybe if your journey has kind of correlated along the path of accessible design.
So to answer your first question on how the perspective affects design, is that what you're saying? You know, when I think about it, disability, a lot of our challenges that we come across as people with disabilities is because the environment is not designed for us. Okay, you know, not being able to go up a flight of stairs makes me disabled, and yet if there was a different way to get into the building, then I wouldn't be disabled, really. So that's how it affects design. If you could design things with a different perspective, with thinking of more people than just the average person who you're designing for, then a lot of times the accessibility that you could build into things is helpful for everybody, not just the person with the disability. And so if we can get more people to think that way, you know, wider doorways into the bathroom is not negative for anybody, really. And yet today, 30 years after the ADA, and still there are many bathrooms that I cannot use. And so it's just a constant frustrating thing to be in an environment that is not designed to us, making us more disabled than we really have to be. Is there another part? What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So I think taking your thinking about that and talking about how it's not necessarily it is a disability, but being someone with a disability doesn't tend to come into play very much until you are in your environment and you're noticing all these inaccessible right. materials, essentially.
Yes.
And so would you say that by navigating society that is inherently oppressive and ableist, did you find that to be sort of the catalyst for your career in engineering?
Kind of. So, you know, when I was a kid, I used to watch I Dream a Genie, you know, and I wanted to be an astronaut because what better place to be in where I don't need the wheelchair to be in space, to be floating around. And so that was my fascination with space and the whole space industry and going into that. Also, I wanted a career that, as you know, more specifically as an engineer, I thought, well, maybe if I'm trained to think that way, then it would be helpful in my life, in my everyday life. Because let's say I'm having trouble reaching something, then if I think like an engineer, maybe I could design a tool if I don't have one readily available, or if I can't find anything online, you know. So it was just a way to kind of get to a point where I could be self-sufficient and everyday problem solving, which I would say, as a person with a disability, a lot of us have those think outside the box type of thinking. We automatically kind of think that way, which is a good reason to hire us, by the way. But you know, something that's often overlooked is when people think of hiring people with disabilities, they don't think of all of the great assets and strengths we could bring to the table. Instead, they're thinking of all the myths and all their preconceptions of what we can and can't do. So yeah, it all kind of helps everything to be taught that way and to live the experience I have as a person with a disability.
I love how bold and enthusiastic you are about your perspective and about the perspective of the community that you know, surround yourself with and are within. I really appreciate that, especially when we're thinking about the STEM field and how historically inaccessible it always has been, and the sort of systems that were established to be exclusive, like using science as an exclusionary tool. So I love you taking back the narrative and charging forward with it and creating these accessible spaces. I think that's fantastic. In thinking about, not in thinking about, but in reference to, you'd mentioned just kind of your, in short, you'd mentioned thinking about how early on you wanted to live in this space or have this career, this trajectory of being a tinkerer, a creator, an engineer. I'd love to hear more about maybe how your family took it and how your family encouraged you. I'd watched in previous interviews, you'd mentioned your mom a lot, and I'd love to hear sort of the influence of family on this journey, not only as an engineer, but as someone who's also navigating disability and going into this heavily oppressive field.
Right. My I was adopted at a very young age. I was placed with my family at 2 months old. So I don't want to refer to them as my adopted family because they're just my family, right? And I'm very lucky because the family I ended up with was very good for me. And my mom in particular, she was a force in life, and she was a very independent person, and she taught me to fight for the services that I was entitled to, and also to not let what other people think of me get in the way. Now, I remember, I'll give a perfect example, and this was my first year in college. And here you're thinking, my first year in college, I should be well past the part of being insecure about my body and everything. But I was in my first year, and I was at a barbecue with my housemates and my roommate, and I was eating, and I don't think I had my hooks on, so I was eating without them. And a girl came in from behind, and my friend in front of me saw the face she made. And she goes, "Oh, when she saw you, she made this face like, ew, you know?" And I called my mom crying. Here I am, my first year in college, calling her crying. And my mom said, "Dana, why are you crying? I mean, if you were home, you wouldn't let that stupid girl bother you. You wouldn't let her bother you." She goes, "You're just homesick." And I realized that was totally true, you know, being away from my family for the first time, and then now dealing with society's reactions to my disability. It was too many things at once, and I just kind of fell apart. So, you know, she is a big reason why I'm very independent in my drive. She helped my drive to be independent. And one thing that she and my dad both instilled in me was that you need to get a job where you can support yourself. You know, you don't want to be having to depend on systems that are out there to help people, but if you use those systems, then you're restricted by what they could do. And you want to be able to call the shots and what you want. So all of that was really helpful. And you know, one thing is, growing up, they never told me no. They always encouraged me. And so that was a big part of my success. And not only that, but just the opportunities I was given. I was lucky that I was mainstreamed at such a young age, and that the people in my life who were positive about my abilities they far outnumbered the people who weren't, you know, and that helps too. But the bottom line is, you can't let other people's negative thoughts about you stop what you want to do.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. I love this encouraging family you have, and all of these wonderful tools that they were able to provide. No wonder you're so phenomenal. Before I move on to the next section, I'd love to kind of wrap up that sort of our preliminary discussion about your journey with sort of, do you have any maybe thoughts or advice regarding tools or sort of, how would I word this? What would you like to see in the future in terms of accessibility, not only on maybe on an engineering front, but also on an interpersonal front? Like, what would you like to see in the future when you think about all the encouragement and the tools and your journey in the past? What do you believe we should continue carrying on, I guess I could say? And what do you think heavily needs to be, you know, integrated into continuing a journey of this fully accessible STEM pathway?
I think there's a couple things. First of all, I think society, for the most part, you know, they need to look at the disabled community. They need to look at us as just any other individual. You know, we have strengths and we have weaknesses just like anybody else. You know, and don't look at us just by what you think we can't do. You know, ask us, what can you do? You know, what are the great things you could do? What are your talents? What are your strengths? And focus on that. And by doing that, you're going to help us excel, you know, and to go higher. And then secondly, just be more inclusive. You know, when you're doing activities, when you're planning social events, really consider where you're holding them, you know, because it doesn't feel good to be excluded because the place you want to go to is not accessible, you know. Or it could be something as simple as, oh, I'm going to invite the whole our whole branch to my house for a barbecue, and yet your bathroom's not accessible, right? Now I know that's not what you intended, but it's still kind of it's kind of sad because I want to do those types of events to build my teamwork with the group. And so those types of things, always be thinking that way. You know, every activity that you're doing, everything along the way, are you making it accessible to everybody on your team?
Accessibility is 100% the future.
Yes, yes.
Yes. I would love to shift into this collaboration you have upcoming with the Exploratorium, specifically you being an ambassador for If Then, and this sort of mentor role or this like guide role you are now taking on with this being an ambassador. And so, you know, what is it like to be in this headspace as a representative of like all of your identities and STEM, like, you know, integrating that into STEM and being a mentor and someone to look up to? I would love to hear everything you have to say about that.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because as a kid growing up, I always kind of shied away from being in the spotlight, and I wanted to be inconspicuous and blend in with the crowd because I never could, right? And so as I got older and I was in my career, and I've been in my career for years, I realized being in this position is actually it's a great thing. It's a really wonderful opportunity to be able to have instances where you could influence groups of kids. And I always have believed it's important to encourage our youth to go into STEM. You know, the United States wants to lead any industry, any field, then we need to put more value on education. And that's one of the things, it's a little bit of my pet peeve, is that this country, you know, values other things much more than education and, you know, like entertainment and sports and all that stuff. And I'm not saying those things aren't important, but what I'm saying is I think education is just as important. And yet our educators get paid peanuts compared to other things. And so that's my biggest frustration, is I wish that we as society, as a whole country, valued education more so that we could encourage our youth and our future generations to excel and to do well and to protect our environment and to do all the things we need to do to live a long and healthy life.
And how does If Then sort of play into that role of catalyzing? That's okay.
Yeah,
No, your sentiment was so powerful. And I think it definitely leads into, you know, how does this empowering moment you've had here about like education, how does If Then encourage you or encourage that message?
Well, If Then is incredible because it takes us a set of 120 ambassadors, and it uses a talent agency model to promote us across the country for a period of time. And so it's maximizing our ability to reach the maximum number of girls. And we want to focus on like middle school girls to encourage them to go into STEM, because, you know, girls are just as good as boys in math and in science and all that. And a lot of them are interested when they're younger, but unfortunately, as they get older, they kind of lose that interest and that drive. And I think on one hand, our society is saying, yeah, we want girls to go into STEM. On the other hand, society still, through media, through family, they still encourage the girls just to focus on getting married and having a family. And it's sad because they could do both, but they need help. They can't do a lot more times than not, the women are always having to do the family, you know, be the spouse and the person working, and it's tough to do everything. So, you know, it's just, we need a big shift in the way that we value our women, because I think the bottom line is we don't value women enough, and to encourage them to work and to have family and to be everything that men are.
Yes, that's so powerful. I love as someone who's femme identifying, I love the idea of always encouraging women and thinking about what has societally and historically been a woman's role, you could say,
Right.
and how groups like If Then and work that you do in general is changing that narrative, you could say. And I have so much hope for the future of femme labor and what that looks like. And I
Yes.
love that is in everything you do. I see that, and that's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I would love to take a little bit of a turn, just like have a little exploratorium moment. And the theme and the mission of the exploratorium is to learn through curiosity and collaboration, and sort of reflecting on all of the wonderful sentiments you've just shared about being an engineer and an advocate and an ambassador, an educator, a powerful woman. Do you find curiosity and collaboration to be themes themes that have sort of resonated with you in all of the things that you've done?
Definitely curiosity of what sorts of things can I accomplish? Can I really get a job as an engineer and succeed? Can I really move away from my family, live independently? I mean, there's a lot of curiosity is kind of at the base of everything, almost everything I do. And collaboration, that's key, because I do believe that we're all here on this earth to help each other get through life. And so there are very few things, in my opinion, where that should be done just completely on your own. I feel like we need each other. And to do great things, it takes a lot of minds, I think, together to think of, the diversity, right? The diversity of all the thinking, all the different perspectives that people bring to the table. And that's another reason why diversity is so important in the workplace in particular, is when you're solving these big problems and you're trying to create these amazing things, then you need all the different perspectives to come up with the best solution. And it's important. Collaboration is really important.
Yes, I'd actually love to, if you would want to expand more on maybe your thoughts about like diversity, equity, access, and inclusion within the STEM field, and what your experience has been with that, and maybe some of the key roles you've had to play yourself and had to collaborate with on others.
Yeah. So throughout my career, I've always been involved in employee resource groups. The ones I've led the disability one mostly, but I still did get involved in the women's group and LGBT and Hispanic group. And it's, the workplaces, I do, well, especially with last year with all the, with the Floyd murder and all that's kind of highlighted, the fact that we have all these inequities and we need to fix it. We need to think differently. We need to, it's a cycle, right? Because we went through all this like in the 60s, and then people get complacent, and then it goes down again, and then you have to do it again. So we're at the point now where everybody's talking about it. It's like a buzzword idea, right? Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. But I'm hoping that people really see the value, and really feel it and really believe in it, so that it's not just a passing fad, and that it's a true evolution of our thinking and of our humanity to embrace everybody and to make the world a better place for everybody.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Agreement to everything you said. As someone who works in DEIA myself, I find myself often in that same thinking of I see these waves of complacency, and then activism, and then complacency, and then social media activism, and I'm always waiting for the moment for the activism to break through social media or performatism,
Right.
and
Right.
see it in my workplaces and in my everyday surroundings. So
yeah, and then what's frustrating too is when, especially you have the leaders of organizations saying, yeah, it's important to me, and yet as soon as it comes up with any type of controversy, then they're like, and they don't support it. And you're like, wait a minute, if it's a value, you need to defend it when it's under attack. You don't just say it when it's easy, So that's when you really see a true value. Do they defend it when there's practices and people going against it? That shows whether or not they really value it.
absolutely. Thank you again for sharing all of your wisdom so far. I want to take a little bit of a fun turn to kind of wrap us up together. And I heard through the grapevine, perhaps, that you are a fan of sci-fi and have lots of thoughts about science fiction as a catalyst for STEM and as a fun form of entertainment in your life. And so I'd love to hear maybe how, what forms of science fiction, what roots of science fiction have sort of influenced your career path. And then also, did your enjoyment of science fiction ever allow you to think big about the future of technology and inherently how accessible it can be, no matter how futuristic it might feel?
Let me see. Science fiction. I like science fiction. I wouldn't say I'm like an extreme science fiction person because I don't know all the players and I don't know every episode of Star Trek and all that. But my favorite science fiction characters, I guess, would be well, I don't even know if they consider them X-Men. X-Men was my favorite series, and what I love about it is I know that they're not from outer space, right? But they I love it because they have these unique gifts, right? These unique abilities, and the head of the group, of course, he's in a wheelchair, right? I forgot, what is it, Patrick Stewart? So I love it that he has that cool machine that he uses and he's leading up the team and he's this, smart guy and all that stuff. So that's kind of a nice role model for a change. I mean, you don't, growing up, there weren't really many role models with disabilities that I saw, but when I saw that come out, I was really happy to see that. It was really cool.
Yes, I love that. I'd mentioned to you, but my mother growing up, my mom was deaf. And so I remember she always had lots of pictures of Spider-Man because when Spider-Man shot webs out, he made the I love you symbol.
Oh my God.
And so I also found myself at this like intersection of superheroes and disability and this like the ilk symbol all over my home.
That's
so
wonderful.
I love that we have this like similar path of representation through odd media and specifically through science fiction.
Yeah. True.
And I think my last question would be if you're able to expand on this at all. In the most general of terms that I could come up with, your work looks into eventually announcing the discovery of life beyond Earth. And I would love to hear about what that looks like for you, and how do you think about that? How do you get into that kind of line of thinking and working?
Yeah, it's, a lot of people have thoughts on their belief whether or not there is, right? Me personally, not my place of employment, but I do believe there is life, because I think to think there's not is just too narrow-minded. To think that we would be the only ones in the whole universe, when you look at how big and expansive that is, whether or not we could find it is a whole other thing, because it's not an easy thing. It's a very difficult thing to do. Finding it inside of our solar system is difficult. And then even to think about going out further, which there are a lot of people who specialize in exoplanets, planets outside of our solar system, then that adds another layer of difficulty, right? Because everything is so far away. But as far as how do you get to that place, you just have to have an open mind and to have the belief and to have the curiosity, which you mentioned before, and the inkling to be collaborative, because the field of astrobiology it's very multidisciplinary. There's all these different disciplines that are included in that area, and it's an amazing field to go into. If anybody has an interest at all in that, I highly recommend it. It's a very diverse field, a lot of young people in it, and it's exciting. I've never seen such a happy group of people, so many all together. So it's exciting, and it'd be great if it happened in my lifetime. I don't know if it would, but I'd be happy.
I certainly hope it does. I would love to see that. I'm always so curious as to what's out there. I'm always looking up at the sky and I'm like, it can't just be me. It can't just be the same thing every day. There's got to be something going on out there, and I want to see it. So I truly hope your work leads to some amazing discoveries. Dana, thank you so much for all of your time and your energy and magic that went into this conversation with you. And we really appreciate having you here to talk to us during After Dark.
Thanks, Lavender. It's been this has been one of my favorite interviews so far.
Wow, I'm glad to have been a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
For tonight's final segment, we will hear from particle physicist Dr. Jessica Esquivel. Dr. Jessica Esquivel was born and raised in Texas. She is one of less than 150 Black women with a PhD in physics in the country, and the second Black woman to graduate with a PhD in physics from Syracuse University. She currently is at Fermilab, where she is part of the particle physics experiment Muon G2. She is also a AAAS If Then ambassador, a member of the Change Now Collective, a science communicator, and a vocal advocate for the increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. She is one of the co-founders of Black in Physics. She is joined in the conversation by my colleague, Kathleen McGuire.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm so pleased to be here with Dr. Jessica Esquivel. And to get things started, in other interviews, I've heard you share a really great story about when you first became aware of scientist as being an exciting job. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, as well as your path to pursuing your career in physics.
Yeah, so when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I used to spend a lot of time with my aunt. She used to babysit us a lot, and we spent most of that time watching sci-fi movies or sci-fi shows. I was really into space and aliens and, you know, what's out there in the unknown. And in one of those movies, it was called Contact with Jodie Foster. That's essentially the first time that I was introduced to an astrophysicist or a scientist. And the fact that, you know, she was able to study what she wanted to study and work on, you know, these big old experiments really just intrigued me and fascinated me. So at 7 years old, I was walking around saying that I wanted to be an astrophysicist when I grew up. And I'm really thankful to my mom and my aunts for fostering that that interest, that curiosity, because, you know, media is really, really important to showing what you can be when you grow up. But it's, to me, the family and the people that you're surrounded with that continue and foster that excitement, that curiosity. So yeah, I was lucky in that.
Yeah, that is amazing. And could you tell us a little bit too about how you went from sort of understanding it through sci-fi, which you loved, and moving into your maybe academic path, as well as sort of, yeah, finding your place as a physicist as a career?
Yeah. So one of the things that my family did in fostering that that interest was when I was a teenager, a tween, they took me to NASA. I'm Texas born and raised, so NASA in Houston is kind of like in our backyard, and they sprung for the VIP tour. So we were able to not only see all of the, you know, areas that the general public sees, but they also took us in the back to see what, you know, physicists were actually doing. And I was bored. There was no like aliens on the screen. Nobody was yelling, you know, Houston, we have a problem. I don't even remember seeing like a spaceship on a picture or anything like that. But it was the same trip where we went to, it's called the Buoyancy Lab. And it's a big old swimming pool with you know, space shuttle underwater, and we got to see, you know, astronauts floating around and, you know, learning how this zero gravity was going to feel, and start learning how to use tools in this, environment. And that really struck me. And it was there where they told me, these are engineers. Engineers are the ones that, are training them, that are building all of these tools to help them learn what it's going to be like out in space. So it was at that point in time that I was like, okay, I've changed my life's path, and I'm deciding right now that I'm going to be an engineer. And then I went to undergrad at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, and I took my first physics course, and that was it. Like, I was in love. I just really enjoyed the weirdness of what physics could be, and the unknown. And it really brought me back to when I was a kid, watching those movies and being fascinated with the what if and what's out there. And it was just closer aligned to that intrigue, to that curiosity, than what engineering was for me. That was very much applied. And I really liked the awe of not knowing. So it was, again, right then and there that I made up my mind and said, I'm going to do physics. And then I had a conversation with my mom, and she was like, I'm not going to pay for you to be a perpetual student for the rest of your life. You need to get a job. So I had to kind of learn, well, what does a physicist do? And where can they work? And how much do they get paid? And it was kind of like a back and forth with my mom and with my advisor, who was in the physics department, to actually kind of learn about what are the paths that a physicist can take. And, that give and take back and forth, we settled. And I double majored in both electrical engineering and applied physics, and was able to continue that path of learning about the weirdness of physics.
Which I guess maybe we'll stick with the weirdness for a second. And physicists are often grappling with questions that are just so huge, and I know for my mind, like, very hard to comprehend because they're so big. So I'm just curious, is there a particular big question that physics is pursuing, or that could be pursued by physics, that you're particularly intrigued by or curious about?
Yeah, so I've spent the past 8 years, maybe, I don't know, studying particle physics. And what particle physics is the study of the smallest building blocks of the universe. So, you and I are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? And everybody's really familiar with that. And then we have photons that are come from light, and that's how we see. So these are particles that we're very, very familiar with. But if you keep digging, if you keep scratching at the surface, you find out that protons and neutrons are actually made up of a smaller particle, what we call a subatomic particle, called quarks. And, if you find a particle, you get to name it. So that's how that fun name came to be. And we've been doing this for a good amount of time, trying to come up with our version of the periodic table, right? And we call this the standard model. So it's a theory of the particles that we know exist, but there's holes in it. One of the things that we haven't been able to figure out is how gravity kind of plays a part at really, really small scales, the scales of, tiny building blocks. We don't know why there's more matter than antimatter, because at the beginning of everything, there was supposed to be equal parts matter and antimatter. And when matter and antimatter come together, there's just a huge explosion. So there shouldn't be us. We shouldn't exist. We're the weird ones in the universe. All of the particles that we've, gathered up into our little standard model, those make up only 5% of what's out there. So we're the weird ones. And, chasing what else is out there, figuring out what dark matter is, figuring out what dark energy is, figuring out how gravity fits into, you know, our theory. That's just it, right? That's the bread and butter. It's just so fascinating and exciting to be on the bleeding edge of literally society's knowledge. So it's just a fun chase.
Yeah, it's amazing, and yeah, just mind-blowing to think about from the perspective of a casual listener.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe bringing in a little bit of the voice of your mother that you mentioned as you were making your career choice. So what does it look like in the day-to-day trying to figure these things out? And what are some of the sort of scientific tools or approaches that you're using in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. My day doesn't look the same. Every day is different. One day I could be like literally just zoned in and coding the whole time. And the reason why we use, you know, coding, so C++ or Python, is because the experiments that we work on, like I said, they mirror Jodie Foster's experiments that she was working on. They're big, and we work, you know, in collaborations, which can be small or big. But these experiments put out massive amounts of data. And the job of a particle physicist is actually to take that data, to ask it questions and look for the answer in it. So one of the things I spend a lot of my time in is just developing software or analyses to ask the data questions, right? And hope that it gives the answer that we need. But other times, we're maintaining these massive experiments. The experiment that I work on now is called the muon G-2 experiment. And the basis of it is a 50-foot diameter ring, a magnetic ring. And there are so many different components that go into the experiment that sometimes we can no longer talk to a specific circuit board, or we're not getting data from a subsystem, or, you know, we're seeing sparking in our high voltage system that we need to mitigate. So there's a lot of maintenance that also goes into these types of big experiments. So it depends on the day. It depends on the day.
And I guess you've also sort of, did you expect to be cultivating these kinds of skill sets around programming and data analysis as you were going through your schooling, or is that sort of something that became part of your career that was unexpected?
Yeah, I would definitely say it was unexpected. I don't think I went in knowing that there was going to be so much software and data analysis. And it wasn't until I had my first internship the summer after my freshman year where I learned the importance of that skill set and these tools. In my internship, I was actually working for the Air Force in the optical radiation branch. And I had to learn everything. I had to learn C++. I had to learn, you know, parallel processing, which means splitting up one code into multiple threads so it could be done faster, and learning how to split up a code so that so this thread has a piece that this thread needs, right? And while you want to split them parallel, this one needs to just go a little bit faster so it can feed in. Anyways, it was a lot. It was a lot of programming that I learned in, I think, 3 months. But it was that internship that really showed me, okay, physics also means coding. Physics also means software development. And I need to get good at this to be able to answer the weird questions that I want to answer. And I'm very thankful to, you know, the people that I worked with in that internship, because they allowed me to put together, software development and physics and build these skills that I needed. And honestly, I think that's my favorite part now about being a physicist. While I think it's really cool to go into like our experiment hall and get my hands dirty and fix things, looking at the data, man, it's just, I don't know. I like that better.
And we're going to sort of shift gears a little bit. In tonight's program, we're particularly highlighting the If Then initiative, which is designed to further women in science, technology, engineering, and math by empowering current innovators and inspiring the next generation of pioneers. And you are an If Then ambassador. So I'm curious what that entails and also why you wanted to be part of the initiative.
Yeah, so I think the reason why the AAAS If Then ambassadorship is so unique is because it takes this idea of a talent agency model, and it puts women in STEM, like me, in spaces and places where middle school girls get their content. So through this ambassadorship, I've learned about TikTok, I've learned about Twitch, I've learned about Instagram, and just being able to show that, one, women in STEM exist. We're not invisible, we're not unicorns, we're here, we're doing amazing things, but also showing that we're not robots, and that we have personalities and we have interests and hobbies outside of the job that we do. I don't eat, breathe, and sleep physics. I, have interests like makeup and cosplay and, DIYing, and I love HGTV. And I think that's what's really, really cool about the ambassadorship, is that we get to see a fully realized human being with loves and interests and family who are also women in STEM. And the fact that we are being placed in media, right, online, like events like this, where you can get to know us, I think is what's really, really awesome about the ambassadorship. And I wanted to be a part of that. Like, I'm here because people in my life realized that I was interested in STEM, and they fostered that interest. And I had, mentors that put me in the right classes and connected me with the right people so that I could build the skill sets to be a successful physicist. So I in my life, not only have I seen the importance of media in showing girls what can be, but also the importance of mentors and people that take a vested interest in you and support you through the journey. So I just wanted to be a part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I hope maybe at the end we can make sure to put up, do you have a TikTok where people can find you so we can see your TikTok videos?
I do. It's, a couple of videos, but yes. The kids these days, they're so creative. I love going on TikTok, but I have to limit my intake because I can just, scroll constantly.
It's also interesting too, because you work in a space where it's very hard to communicate quickly what you're doing because it's so complex. So I am interested, like, how do you do science communication on TikTok?
Yeah, so yeah. It's hard. I don't have a lot of videos on there, but I definitely focus on what, like I kind of talked about it here. What does a job in physics look like, right? What are some of the things that I do day to day? I explain particle physics in a very, I think, visual way, which that's why I think, the A in STEAM is really important, because even in, data analysis and the software development that I do, I use visuals. I use visualization to communicate, the science that I'm doing. And that's internally, that's, with my collaborators, with my peers. So I really understand how important it is to be, good and effective at communicating science in and outside of your field. But yeah, I focus on what we do day to day.
Okay. I guess also tying back to the many interests you have outside of physics, although relating back again to your work in physics, I came across a panel you were a part of at WakandaCon, which I encourage everybody to look up because it sounds amazing, in 2018, that was centered around imagining inclusive futures through using speculative media like Afrofuturism as a lens for the conversation. So I'm curious what you think a path forward is for STEAM fields to become more equitable and inclusive. And I'd also love to hear how you make that connection to the way sci-fi can be used to communicate or create these forward-looking futures.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've talked about my background and learning about a scientist through media, through a sci-fi movie. So I think just my background shows how important media is, but then you can even step it back and start looking at the old sci-fi movies from 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s and see, innovations and ideas that were fiction at one point are now real, right? Artificial intelligence wasn't a thing. And now I'm using it in my data analysis all the time. Cell phones, that was like a Star Trek thing, right? And now they get bigger and smaller depending on the year. Hoverboards, not a thing when it came out in Back to the Future. And now, I see kids on the little hoverboards all the time. So not only does it show what could be and who a scientist could be, but it also shows, where we can go with science and what we could do with science. So I really think, I don't know. I mean, I love sci-fi movies. I love sci-fi shows. And I think they're super entertaining, but media is one way that we can also inject science. And show that science is literally everywhere. And I think that's why AAAS IF Then ambassadorship is so important, because they recognize, and we as an ambassadorship recognize that science is everywhere, and we can, infuse media from, your laptop to your TV with it. So I don't know. I think it's just fascinating. And kind of bringing it back to WakandaCon, the reason why I was so interested in being a part of this convention was because it was centered around Black Panther and the Black experience. And I really wanted to kind of tap into that and show that the science that was in the movie Black Panther is, something that can be a reality, right? Talking about, magnetic levitation and super cooling of magnets so that they can, hover. All of this is we're right there. So really tapping into the science and the STEM that was shown in the movie to connect with underrepresented groups in the science was just, it was a match made in heaven.
And we're gonna wrap up soon, and I have two more questions for you. But the first one is, I just hope to give you a platform to talk about the amazing initiative that you were one of the founders of in its first year, Black in Physics. Could you talk a little bit more about Black in Physics and your plans for it this year?
Yeah. So Black in Physics kind of popped up during the civil unrest in our country last year after the murder of George Floyd and the awareness that was happening with regards to police brutality in our country. And it followed initiatives like Black in the Ivory and Black Birders Week. And it was a way of bringing together Black physicists across the country and even across the world to a space, a virtual digital space where we could build community and where we could find people that look like us that are doing physics. So it was definitely a community-centered initiative. And while we had, the offshoots of showing the world that we're here and that we exist, and showing the world the awesome physics that we are doing as a Black community, it was focused on us and focused on bringing us together for healing and for sharing our experiences that we deal with in a predominantly white space that is physics. And most of the time, we as Black physicists are the only or one of few. We are, breaking barriers and glass ceilings by becoming the first to be to have a PhD at a university, to be the first postdoc at a laboratory or at a university. So it's really isolating being the only. It's really it feels like you're alone. So by creating Black in physics, even though you might be the only at your institution or at your university, seeing other people across the country and across the world that are also Black, that also do physics, was just really affirming. Yeah, and I'm really, really excited to have been a part of that. And for this year, we want to continue building that community and continue raising awareness of the amazing Black excellence that's in our physics community. And we just are right now stepping back and really focusing on what our community needs and moving forward once we figure that out in our head. But I think one of the really unique parts of our organization is that we are all early career, and we do have a very intersectional lens, even within our founding and organizing members. And we understand that Black people in general, but Black physicists specifically, aren't a monolith, right? And even just looking at me, I'm Black, I'm Latina, I'm a woman, I'm lesbian. My experiences are going to be different than, say, a cishet, Black male. And we need to live in that. And we need to develop programming that celebrates all of the facets of what a Black physicist means. Yeah, so I'm just really excited to continue to grow that.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's such an amazing initiative. And now we'll look at one other facet of your identity and point back to an interest you mentioned earlier. So throughout the program, we have seen you maybe putting together an impressive makeup look in celebration of Pride. So I'm interested in what Pride means to you, and also if you want to share a little bit about your love of makeup and your look, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I've always, I think, loved makeup. When I was old enough, my aunt took me to Mary Kay and we learned how to put makeup on. And ever since then, I've just really been interested in the fact that you're able to kind of morph and transform and highlight different aspects of your face and your interests by the colors that you get to play with and use. And I don't know, I think it's another way that you can kind of talk about physics, right? And talk about how shadowing here, right, means that the light that's, you know, hitting right there gets absorbed. And that's why you have like cheeks for days.
I feel like you just landed on a perfect physics TikTok video.
Yeah.
The crossover.
Definitely. Yeah, so I just think that it's really, really fun to play with makeup. And what was the other?
We're here in Pride Month.
Yes, yes.
What is Pride? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been celebrating Pride even before I came out, even before I realized and recognized that I was a lesbian. It's just really awesome to be among people that are celebrating their authentic selves. And it fills literally me with pride to be amongst a community of people that are just unapologetic in who they are and living their best lives. So for me, that's what pride means, is to just be who you are out loud and as vibrant as possible. So what this makeup look is inspired by, obviously, is by pride, but also kind of showing that we are all weird. We are all queer. And I kind of touched upon that in the beginning when I was talking about the building blocks of the universe and how we're actually the weird ones in our universe. The fact that we exist, the fact that we are made out of these particles is queer. We weren't supposed to happen. So really just kind of living in that we're all just a little bit weird. And the reason we exist is also weird. So I like to draw parallels between, you know, the LGBT plus community and just physics and particle physics and how we're 5% of what's out there. And at the end of the day, we're all just a little bit weird.
It's a perfect ending. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. This was really a delight.
Yeah, it was really, really fun talking with you.